writing the basic essay. Now, I do put a bit of a disclaimer saying that this is the basic essay, meaning that if you're looking to get a high or a very high, you will need to employ the steps from step 5, which we'll be going through in our next lesson. But these are already available on the class page if you wish to pre-read them. So the basic introduction. You should start with the trigger. So what is the issue? How did this topic come about? What's the background information? Whether you're given 1 article, 2 articles, or 3, all of them will be on the same topic or the same issue. So in a sentence or 2, you should outline what the issue is and why it's come to the forefront. On your VCA style pieces, you would be able to use the background information, which is in a small box at the start of the paper, and it will tell you why this issue's come about. So you can paraphrase that to begin the essay. If you are given 1 or 2 pieces, you will need to introduce them both in the introduction. Essentially, by using this formula, you'll then start to become very fluent in introducing your article. For each text, you must separately introduce the following elements: the author, the text type, the source, meaning was it the Herald Sun, was it the Age, or a fictitious place that they've made up if it's a VCAR paper. If there's a relevant date, the writer's main contention. Notice that you're only introducing their overall stance on the topic and not their arguments. Your introduction should be brief, and it's different to when you write a text response like what we did with the lieutenant. Don't introduce the arguments. You don't have to. You're going to do them in the body paragraphs later on. So just put in what their overall stance is. You should talk about the tones that they use throughout their piece. Note that it says tones. There will be tonal shift across the piece. So if you need to list 2 of them in the introduction, then that's fine. Most importantly, you should include the target audience, and it may be more than 1 subgroup, along with the overall purpose. What are they trying to do by publishing this piece? Is it that they are trying to get us to do something or think something on a particular issue? If so, you need to outline it here. If you have 2 pieces, you could use the word in contrast in between, showing that you're about to look at whether they share the same viewpoint or they differ in the same viewpoint before introducing the second piece. Try to change things up. You'll notice that if you look at the very basic scaffold, a lot of the wording in orange introducing text 1 is the same as for text 2. Try to swap the word contends for argues. Try to swap the word encourages for bolsters, just so it doesn't sound so repetitive. If you can memorize that, that's the first step in writing a really good introduction. Obviously, to reach a high or very high level, you'd want to start swapping those words in that template for your own language, which you can find on the OneNote under the vocab list. Now, once you've written your introduction, you move on to your body paragraphs. Now, unlike other areas of study, this is really flexible. This is just one way that you can structure your argument analysis. The hardest part about this is it really depends on the article, how many paragraphs you should write. It also depends on the number of articles you've been given. If you've only been given 1 article, I would probably just write 3 paragraphs. 1 on argument 1, argument 2, argument 3. Even if they have more arguments, you can't write on everything in that amount of time. However, what if I have 2 pieces and they're of equal length? If they're of equal length, I'd probably write 1 to 2 paragraphs on the first writer, 1 to 2 paragraphs on the second writer, and if you can, write a comparative paragraph at the end. Now that's quite controversial. It doesn't say in the study design that you have to, but it does say that you need to compare. We'll talk a little bit about that paragraph later on. So there is no hard and fast way that you have to structure this response. I'm not saying the number of paragraphs you have to write because it depends on the length and the depth of the article you've been given. However, if you're given 2 articles, you do have to write on both. If one of the articles is super short, you're only going to write 1 body paragraph on it, surely. Okay, and the other piece is super long, you might write 2 or 3. So this bit is really up to you. The structure is flexible. You should map out the writer's arguments, look at the length and the number of paragraphs that you could possibly write, and go from there. As long as you have a logical structure, you're mapping their arguments, then we're going to be really happy with that. Within the body paragraph, however, there is a certain structure that we'd like you to follow. Now, each paragraph should start with the argument. The writer argues that, and whatever their point is. Then you would go through 2 or 3 bits of language, so particular devices used by the writer that have stood out in that argument. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how you avoid listing those things and start to become more fluent. But as I said, this is just the basics. Once you've written your argument, start with technique 1. The writer uses a rhetorical question, and then you would give the example from the text. You must put it in quotation marks because you have taken it out of the text and you're using it as evidence. You would then talk about how it positions the reader. So what are the effect words? If it's a rhetorical question, it might make it memorable. So you would say, the rhetorical question used by the writer positions the reader to make memorable, and then talk about how this builds the argument in green. So this compels the reader to think what about the topic, think what about the argument. So really, it's a 4-step approach there. Talk about the technique, give an example of the technique, give the effect word, and then explain how it makes the reader feel and how it bolsters the argument. Then you'd move on to a 2nd or 3rd device, and you would repeat the process again. Talk about what the device is, give the example, give the effect word, talk about how it builds the argument. This structure here should help you to do that in a basic way. We can see here that it is color-coded. So green is where you talk about the writer's argument or about how the language supports the development of the writer's point. Blue is where you talk about the language device used and use the direct quotations, and orange, the effect words. Again, don't make up the effect words. You have a list that I've provided you with. You should be looking them up and using them accordingly. Now, on your practice piece that you've already done, some people use this formula and it worked well for them. If you're at the next level, there's an extension point at the bottom of the slide for you. And this is avoid listing the technique with the word users. You'll see there if you look at the template, in blue it says, his or her use of, and then you list the technique. Now that's really basic. That'll get you a C. What we'd like to see you saying instead of the writer uses, just cross out the word uses. Say, the writer appeals logically, the writer's logic, the writer's rhetorical questioning. It's just less formulaic. It's the way that the VCE assessors want you to write. So it just doesn't sound like you're going, the writer uses this, then the writer uses that, and the writer uses this. So it's really important that if you're trying to get a high or a very high, that wherever you see uses, you cross it out and try and blend the writing in together. It is actually really simple to do when you look at it. And it will affect your results by really, really increasing them if you can manage to do that. But if you're still at this stage and you're just filling in the gaps, that's still perfectly fine as well. You'll still get a mid-range response. Similarly, at some stage you will have to compare the text if you are given 2 or more. One way to do that is to write a comparative paragraph at the end. So if you find that there is some common ground where you can say these 2 pieces are the same or these 2 pieces are different, I'd save that for this point. And it could be their stance on the issue, it could be their tones, it could be similar use of techniques, and you could structure it like this, where you start talking about Article 1 in orange and then talk about Article 2 in blue. Now that would be the most basic way of doing some comparison, but if you are looking to get a high or a very high, I wouldn't write this paragraph at all. What I would do is the higher order skill of making references to comparisons throughout the other paragraphs. So not structuring them like this by going orange, blue, orange, blue, orange, blue. What I would do instead is just wherever possible, throw in some sentence stems. If I'm analysing something, I'll be like, oh, this is unlike Bob's piece, or in a dissimilar way to Karen, and just have those little comments throughout the piece, just indicating that you are doing some low-level comparison throughout. That is more favoured by VCAR assessors than this big chunky standalone paragraph. But if you're struggling and you can't throw those little off-the-cuff comments into the other paragraphs, come to this at the end and at least do some really basic comparison. Lastly, the conclusion. And as I've said previously, 99.9% of your mark has already been decided before you write this. Don't spend a lot of time on it. We simply don't care. Sum up the key arguments and the main contention. Not all of them, just their overall stances. Were there any similarities and differences between the articles that needed to be added? And then lastly, use this easy formula to help you. I would start by commenting on the effectiveness of the article in terms of how it would appeal to the target audience, its overall style, and why. Make sure you explain why this purpose has been achieved or not. So essentially that is the conclusion. Where do we go from here? So our work for the week, we will be working on a set of articles on youth conscription. What is essential is that you annotate the practice articles on youth conscription. These are on your OneNote. And when I say annotate, I want you to do steps 1, 2, and 3. I want you to, step 1, identify the contention and at least 3 arguments from each article. I want you to do step 2. At the bottom, write the text type, tone, audience, and purpose for each article. And then step 3, using your list if you need to, identify at least 8 to 10 pieces of persuasive language per article. Once you've done that, I suggest that you write an introduction, not a body paragraph as yet. We can do those later this week. If you get stuck, you can work on this with a friend and you may wish to compare your annotations together. Maybe you don't have all the devices, but maybe you could help them with the argument and they can help you with the devices. If you would like to move on and do a body paragraph, certainly start one. But next lesson, we are going to do the 5 key steps, which is step 5, how to write the better essay. So I don't want you writing too much on this before I can go through the enhanced points.